According to Duolingo, 30 million people attempted to learn a new language just in the first couple weeks of the pandemic. That's 1 in every 11 people in the US, not even counting those who intended to start a language and didn't, or who started learning a language outside of this period. Learning a language seems to be one of those quintessential goals that most people have and most people give up on. See, learning a language might seem exciting at first, but it's really committing to a lifelong process of learning, of practicing, of going through hardships. It's often frustrating at times when our skills start to plateau or when we need to really find immersion, and it doesn't lead to a lot of immediate tangible results. Aside from being able to communicate with people we couldn't before, learning a new language is often something that doesn't lead to immediate results, immediate rewards. All that said, there's often a good reason for learning a new language. Maybe it's to better communicate with family and friends. Maybe it's to be able to appreciate the art of a certain culture in the way that it was initially intended to be appreciated. Maybe it's that you plan to move to a different country or just spend some time there. Whatever the reason, learning a new language, though difficult, is often a very rewarding process. Now, I personally have never really learned a new language outside of the context of formal education. I only speak English and Russian, and I learned Russian through years of formal education before ultimately traveling there for 4 months. So to learn a new language as an adult, I needed some help. I reached out to the Slow Growth community, a community focused on self-development and personal improvement that I'm a part of, to see if there were any other creators out there who were polyglots and could teach me about learning a new language. That's where I met Jhonny. Now, with 5 languages under his belt, Jhonny was the perfect guide to learning a new language. We got the chance to connect over Zoom, which is when Jhonny shared his experience learning all of those languages and his best advice. Jhonny learned a couple of the languages just growing up in Lebanon, but his experiences learning English and Portuguese illustrate some of the best language learning advice I've heard. In short, Jhonny's advice is to study consistently and read Harry Potter. With an innate passion for learning the language and a desire to better understand the art and culture, Jhonny really immersed himself in the English language, and that's how he was primarily able to learn it. And immersion is perhaps the most effective way to learn a language, even when you're an adult. A research study taught 2 groups of people a set of 13 made-up words and found that those who learned through immersion displayed the brain patterns of native speakers. Though it may be harder to pick up a language as an adult than a child, immersion is still an effective way to get fluent. However, as adults, immersion isn't always a practical option for us. A lot of us have lives and commitments, and we can't just pack up and move to another country for several months at a time. And it might be dangerous going to a different country without knowing any of the language at all, especially if not a lot of people in that country speak English. That's why I think Jhonny's method of learning Portuguese is a much more effective method for those of us who are adults or are just busy with the rest of our lives. Jhonny studies Portuguese in bits and pieces, whether it's making it a habit to study a little bit before bed each day or just trying to get in the habit of learning a bit of Portuguese when he's on his phone instead of getting on social media. Jhonny's method of learning Portuguese is much more realistic and attainable. The combination of those 2 methods seems like the best way to learn a language in a way that's both rewarding and realistic. So to start, find a resource that works for you to really learn the language. Some of us might immediately gravitate towards textbooks, but textbooks are often meant to be taught in a class, and so they contain a lot of formal instruction on grammar, on vocabulary, and not a lot of practical applications. So for some of us, that might be too dense and difficult to follow, but for others, their brain might learn well that way. Then of course there are language learning apps, the most famous of which is probably Duolingo. Now these might work well for people who are already on their phone a lot. The key here is going to be creating a separate trigger for learning languages versus just pulling out your phone. It's not realistic to assume that every time you would normally pull out your phone and distract yourself with social media, you can instead learn a language, and trying to do it that way would probably lead to frustration, failure, or at least inconsistency. So instead, you need to create a specific time of the day where pulling out your phone means that you're going to study the language. And when you do that, it should only be for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes at most. But if you're someone who's easily distracted and being on your phone could lead to interruption or text messages from other people, maybe it's best to look for an online resource that you can use on your laptop without as many distractions as on your phone, or a physical resource like a textbook or some other book. Once you've made the rote studying a habit though, you need to bring in the immersion, and Jhonny had a couple apps he recommended for this. And Johnny's method of learning English by reading a dual language version of Harry Potter is another great way to get immersion. You know, immersion doesn't always have to be speaking with native speakers or traveling to the country. It can be anything from watching TV or a movie in that language to reading a book to reading news articles. Ultimately though, to make your study of language effective, you need to find a way to directly interact with that culture. See, like any habit, reward is an important part of the habit building process for learning language, and especially since this is a long-term habit you're trying to build, you know, it's not necessarily one with a completion date or an end goal. You really need to build rewards to your system. Maybe it's setting a concrete date to travel to whichever country speaks the language you're learning in 2 years or in 3 years, so far off enough in the future that you'll be able to learn the language and save up the money, but near enough that it gives you an end goal. Or maybe you go on a language learning board and find somebody looking to study one of the languages you know, and then you can do kind of an exchange where you get to speak with them and they get to speak with you, and you get to practice the language in that way, maybe once a month. Finding some way to directly interact with the culture, with the language that you're trying to learn, is an important way to reward yourself, to make you feel like you're making progress. Johnny's experience illustrates the importance of immersion in language learning, and though it might be scary or really terrifying at first, finding a way to directly interact with people who speak that language, finding a way to really immerse yourself in it instead of just studying it from a distance, is the best way to both learn the language effectively and reward yourself. Remember, get a clear goal in mind, build the habit of studying and memorization, and then find small ways to immerse yourself. As for each of these steps, try different things, learn what works best for you. After all, language learning is a lifelong process, so you've got plenty of time to try and fail. And thanks again to Jhonny for being willing to speak with me about how he learned 5 languages. If you want to check out his YouTube channel, I've linked that down in the description below, along with some of the resources we talked about in this video.